Sam, why don't you come down here and sit over here? Okay? So this is one of the last sessions of ShareLab. I think it's actually one of the most interesting. So I hope you're not too sleepy. In sort of 60 minutes or so, we'll be opening up for drinks and nibbles. So I hope you stay with us until then. And this session is essentially, we've explored a lot today, alternative forms of thinking about the sharing economy. This session focused really on the mainstream collaborative economy as we know it. Now we know, as I said this morning, a very small number of commercial platforms have scaled very rapidly. Their rise to power has been quite swift, and they've rivaled really any non-profit really in terms of scale. So this session is trying to explore four things. We're trying to look at the evidence of positive social or environmental value that exists within the current mainstream commercial collaborative economy. We're trying to look at what the extent of the potential impact is if a commercial platform chooses to think a little bit differently about what it's doing. So what's the evidence of social value in terms of its core activities, just by virtue of being, what positive impact could it have, or does it have? And if it did something slightly differently, like Airbnb's disaster response, or it decides to data share with cities, what are the sort of spillover effects of social value that could be created by these platforms? We also want to explore what the unintended consequences are of a more peer-to-peer economy. And in this session, we're going to focus a little bit on bias and discrimination, although I'm sure the impact on the labour market and labour market law will pop up a little bit as well. And the fourth aspect that we want to look at is what's possible, a little bit more sort of future casting to say what might the future look like. Is the collaborative economy always going to be collaborative? Is it always going to be peer-to-peer, for example, or might it look different in the long term? So we have got a marvellous set of speakers to come and have a debate, and most of this session will be about debate with you and them, so I'm looking forward to that. But first, I wanted to ask you a question, and I don't know whether we're able to do this via Slido. We are able to do it by Slido, which is brilliant. So we're going to ask you this question at the beginning of the session and then also at the end to see if you've changed your mind. So if you could just take out your smartphones, go back to slido.com. If you need to re-enter your event code, it's ShareLab. And you should get a question that says, on balance, do you think that the commercial collaborative economy is mostly hindering or mostly encouraging social impact? See. Let's see where we end up. Oh, okay. Have most people entered? Oh, no. Okay. Oh. Come on. Okay, well, someone at Nesta keep a note of what we had, which was 40% hindering, I can't see the screen, 33% not sure, 27% encouraging. Let's see if this debate changes anything about our views. I mean, one of the reasons you put on events is to engage and inform, but also to see whether you're changing behaviours or actions or thoughts, which this will be a somewhat crude way of doing that. So let's just invite our first speaker today. This is Stephany. So Stephany, you will know, I'm sure, former CEO of JustPark and Park at My House, now a tech advisor. And as CEO of JustPark, Alex was incredibly successful, grew revenue over 10-fold in 3 years, closed the largest equity crowdfunding for a startup in history. He says he's passionate about smart and hungry people, which means to say he's going to love all of you, I'm sure. So please welcome Alex.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Volume's all right? I think the first thing I'd like to say is that anyone who can integrate Slido into a Saturday night quiz show is going to make a lot of money. This is awesome. Thank you very much for having me, Nesta. Great to be on such an illustrious panel. As Helen was saying, I spent most of my career in tech at JustPark. It used to be called Park at My House. So 5 years and counting there. 1 year as COO, 3 years as CEO, and now on the board and continuing to talk about all kinds of exciting parking-related things. The other thing that I've done that is pertinent to this is I've written a book on the sharing economy called The Business of Sharing. It was published last year by Macmillan, and it was really a different type of book. It was a book by an entrepreneur giving a sort of entrepreneur's take on the sharing economy, which is, I think, an angle you don't hear very often. It's a lot of consultants talking about it, a lot of academics talking about it, but generally entrepreneurs, when you're asked to do things like write a book, just say, kind of know I'm very, very focused on my own business, but I was crazy or stupid enough to agree to write this book. And what I did is I broke down all the chapters into different stakeholders. So there's a chapter on investors, for example, which talks about investors and investment into the sharing economy, but I tell it as like a CEO going to pitch Sequoia Capital. There's a chapter on governments. I talk about the regulatory landscape, but then I also tell it as a CEO having negotiations with Downing Street around restrictions and regulations that get in the way of your business. Anyhow, the story of how I came to write this book is probably relevant. So I got a message one day, and it was an editor from this publisher's, Macmillan, and she says to me, "Hi, can I take you out for lunch?" She was interested in getting me to write this book. And why did she approach me? Well, she approached me because she was a customer of JustPark. So she was one of the about 1.2 million customers that we have now. And she had parked at a JustPark space over the Olympics. So if you're not familiar with what the business does, it allows people to rent out driveways. So that's mostly sort of peer-to-peer, Airbnb for parking. But also, we've expanded and we allow people to rent out spaces at commercial car parks, hotels, that kind of thing. And that's sort of the business is like a sort of booking.com for parking. Anyhow, Kentish Town, a couple of years ago, sat there with an editor. And she tells me about when she was a Park at My House customer. She turned up very, very nervous about this strange interaction she was about to have. She was there with her family. She was turning up at someone's house, was going to leave her car on their driveway. Does she knock on the door? Does she go into their house? Can she? What if she needs to use the toilet? Is that cool? Anyhow, it turned out that she actually did get to know the people who lived in that house. She got to know their family, she got to know their children, and her kids actually stayed later that afternoon and played in the garden with the kids of the family who owned the house. And so from that one experience came an interest in the sharing economy. She got in touch with me, and then the book came. But the point I'm making is that here was an activity that could not really be more humdrum. Parking a car. Like, this is the most commodified, boring, unemotional thing that we kind of do. It's almost the definition of a chore. And yet from that came some social capital. Connection between two families that would never otherwise have occurred. And for me, this is one of the very interesting phenomena about the sharing economy. It's the fact that we're taking these transactions that often were purely financial, purely economic, and we can be introducing a social layer. Now, I think you can look at any sharing economy company, and you can break that down and think about actually what is the blend of social and economic, and that blend will vary, but there's almost always some social. And for me, that is a very big positive for the sharing economy. Like, I don't think we should lose sight of that. Conversely, I think it's naive to assume there is no destruction of social capital. There is. There's plenty of it. I don't think there's as much as creation, but there's plenty of destruction as well. So let's talk about Airbnb, because it's a company that you all know, and Patrick's on the panel, so it'd be fun to sort of wind him up before he goes on stage. So I could tell you about a friend of mine who lives in Paris, and he's got a great apartment in the center of Paris, and one of his friends used to always come into the center of Paris and use his place. Now what happens? He puts it on Airbnb, so he doesn't hang out with his friend. He's making money when previously he was doing something that was really just a favor for his friend. I can think about the people that live in that apartment block in Paris who get absolutely no upside from one of their neighbors renting out their room. There's just risk, danger, disruption, noise, inconvenience, all those kinds of things. And for me, the bigger thing here is that really one valid critique that can be made of the sharing economy is that it's a kind of form of late capitalism. You are placing a financial value on every single potential transaction. And what that means is that actually fewer transactions where the value is very small might happen. Okay? Dan Ariely, a behavioral economist, looks at what happens when you take a bunch of lawyers and say, we'll pay you $50 each to do a will for someone who's vulnerable. They say no, because they're not interested in $50. But if you go to them and say, we want you to make a will for someone valuable, will you please do it from the good of your heart? I'm afraid it's voluntary work. A lot more of them say yes. And so what you can see with the sharing economy is that by placing value on things, you can actually corrode neighborly values. You can corrode neighborly deeds. So anyway, a little bit on social capital. I've got about 1 more minute to make a point, which I'm going to make about efficiencies. So most of these businesses, they have a first claim to fame that is about being economically efficient. They provide things more cheaply than the incumbents. And for me, it's interesting to break down these efficiencies into two things. There's the economic efficiencies, and then there's the accidental, environmental, and sort of almost social efficiencies as well. And I'll use JustPark as an example of that. So JustPark, first claim to fame, it is cheaper. Classic sharing economy route to market. It's cheaper than parking on the streets because you have a whole type of inventory that has way less demand for it, so it's cheaper. Same with Airbnb. Initially, much cheaper because there's way less demand for someone's house than there is for Sheraton Hotel. But after you've actually put in place that efficiency and build a business around that, you see these accidental efficiencies, right? And so for a business like JustPark, that is allowing people to drive straight to a destination, okay? Rather than circling for parking, which is the norm. So, I mean, it's difficult and strange, perhaps, to make an environmental case for a parking company, but I'm going to do that and say, actually, you took the status quo of people driving and circling, and then you say, actually, you have a space, you go straight there. IBM have done some research on this. 20–30% of all the traffic, all the car pollution in CBDs is people looking for parking. You can look at Netflix as well. It's not an environmental business, but it stops people driving to the Blockbuster and pick up DVDs, so it creates some environmental efficiencies. I think my time is just about up, so I will vacate the stage now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for mentioning the environment, which hasn't featured incredibly strongly in some of the sessions that I've been in, but certainly it'd be interesting to explore that a little bit more in terms of the positive value that we have, and quite a nuanced setup there, Alex, really, for the fact that social value is both created and destroyed in a commercial collaborative economy. And I think there's a very nuanced debate there to be had. So let's invite Brhmie Balaram now. Brhmie is a senior research in the RSA's Economy, Enterprise and Manufacturing team. Now, for those of you that follow what she writes, you'll know she writes extensively and eloquently and has published a whole range of reports. And I've asked her to give an overview of her views of what she thinks around social value.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So when Helen and I were initially talking about this, neither of us actually seemed very certain that there was much evidence to support the claims that these commercial platforms generate social and environmental value. It seems to me that this is more of an intuitive claim based on our experience of local grassroots initiatives. Of course, if you're connecting directly to one another in a way that wasn't possible through traditional businesses, then it would seem likely that personal relationships might form. And we certainly have been hearing a lot about how the sharing economy is changing the very nature of trust. So Rachel Botsman, for example, has been saying that these platforms have enabled us to trust strangers at a time when we're losing trust in institutions and in corporations. I think that there might be something to that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have meaningful connection with someone. Similarly, with claims about environmental value, in principle, it seems great that we are making the most of our idle assets. But again, there's skepticism here when it comes to commercial platforms. Have Uber added more cars to the road than they've taken off in London, for example? I'm not sure, because these are things that are difficult to measure. When the RSA talks about social value, we often talk about the potential or possibility further down the line of realizing this sort of value, because I don't really think that we're fully there yet. It's challenging because as these platforms scale, it becomes more difficult for them to sustain that initial social value that they may have started with. And that's why I feel like the key to creating social value in the sharing economy is through third-party innovation and partnership, meaning that external players play a bigger role in deriving value from commercial platforms. So I'm just going to start with a more playful example here by speaking about the RSA Student Design Awards. The Student Design Awards is a 90-year-old competition that the RSA runs for students so that they can design for social change. Last year, with the support of Airbnb, we ran a brief asking students to design for a fairer sharing economy. One of the students took into consideration that as more people have joined Airbnb, they don't always do so because of the original ethos of wanting a unique experience or making new connections. To encourage users to embrace this ethos, he suggested an add-on feature or plugin to Airbnb, which would allow you to search for hosts by shared interests or hobbies, increasing the likelihood of a connection. Similarly, another student suggested a plugin where hosts could pick a charity of their choice that a guest could donate to, just a few quid following their stay if they chose to. And the point of this really was to drive home the message to users that it is actually the community that is hosting you, not Airbnb. This would be a way to recognize this and give back to the local community. I think in particular where this type of innovation and partnership is especially promising, though, is in relation to gig work in the sharing economy or in the gig economy. Although self-employment has been on the rise for many years now, both in the US and in the UK, there has been very little thought given to how to provide self-employed people or independent contractors with a safety net. We now have 4.8 million people who are self-employed in the UK, and it is likely that only a very small proportion of those people are actually gigging for platforms such as Hassel or Deliveroo or Uber. There is an assumption that because most self-employed people are setting their own rates, they're able to ensure that there is a margin that allows them to save for the future. But this is also assuming that people aren't feeling pressured to set competitive rates and thus sacrificing long-term savings for short-term gains, which I suspect is happening in a lot of cases. In the US, we are seeing third parties tackle this issue more widely in self-employment as a result of the emergence of gigging specifically. So Peers, for example, is a portable benefits platform that allows workers to carry insurance coverage and long-term health and pensions plans with them as they move between platforms, which wouldn't be the case if these benefits were tied to the workplace. Partnerships have been formed between platforms and unions, including one between Uber and the International Machinists Association, leading to the creation of the Independent Drivers Guild to better protect, support, and empower workers in New York City. So this guild is seeking more transparency and accountability from Uber, for example, by trying to secure a seat at the table with authorized management in monthly meetings with a council of drivers. And they're also trying to ensure that there's a protection against deactivation through hearings in front of independent panels. And I think that this last point is actually really important because as most people in this room will know, there was an employment tribunal that ruled on Friday that 2 Uber drivers should be classed as workers rather than as self-employed. Being classed as a worker isn't the same as being classed as an employee. It is actually a little-known third category that straddles the binary, and it entitles these drivers to some rights of employees, but not all. A key right they are missing is the right to challenge unfair dismissal. So our legal system has only gotten these drivers so far, whereas the Guild is actually able to address this major concern about unfounded dismissal or deactivation. As many people have also mentioned, there's been a surge of platform co-op activity in the US, including Juno, a ride-sharing platform, directly competing with Uber and Lyft by substantially improving the offer for drivers. So what makes Juno unique is that it is a commercial and cooperative hybrid offering users equity ownership. Its founders have set aside a pool of restricted stock for drivers that they say is equal to their own shares. The more fares a driver picks up, the more Juno shares she can earn. So the Juno model has the potential to completely reorient businesses in the gig economy, which is what makes it so exciting and powerful. Rachel Holt, the head of Uber's North American operations, she recently gave an interview to The New Yorker in which she disclosed that Uber has been looking into giving stock options to its drivers, and they're watching Juno to learn whether such an offer will work. In conclusion, what I'm saying here is that innovation and partnership are key to shaping the future of work in the sharing economy so that it is fair and sustainable. We have some big questions to answer in the interim, such as whether it is possible for gig work to be genuinely empowering. My answer would be that it is, but we can't just leave it up to commercial platforms to ensure this through self-regulation. really our courts, government, and most crucially civil society should be playing a role in helping to realize social value, for example, through the empowerment of workers. So the RSA is trying to develop the concept of shared regulation as a process of collectively keeping the sharing economy in check. And we are doing this through experimenting with citizen engagement and deliberative democracy in some of our other projects. But we certainly see that more collaborative involvement is another way to secure social value in the sector. Thank you.
So thank you. That covered a whole range of issues, didn't it? And I think there is quite a fundamental difference, I think, we would probably agree, between selling and renting and exchanging assets and selling and renting and exchanging your own time and entering into the labour market. And it's also struck me that the very things that make the sharing economy or the collaborative economy work in many settings are the things that are potentially creating some of the challenge. So unfair dismissal, possibly because of ratings and peer reviews. And that leads us really nicely into inviting Professor Mike Luca to join us. Now, Michael is a visiting faculty member at Harvard Business School, and he works very closely with both commercial companies and with US and with the UK government. And his current work focuses on digital data and platforms. And for the purposes of this debate, it's very interesting because he's focusing on the behavioural foundations of how people make choices on digital platforms, and has most recently undertaken research into bias and discrimination on Airbnb specifically. So, Michael, do join us. Please welcome him.
And the slides should be.
They should, if you press next, they should pop up.
You're back. Yep.
You don't have any slides.
Oh, okay.
Are you able to do this without slides?
So I could do it without slides. I wonder if you mind kind of loading these up. Okay. It just says slides and us. So basically, what I wanted to talk about today is some research that I've been doing on the design of online marketplaces. And basically, the motivation for the project that I'll be talking about is this observation that in the last few years, there's been a You could think about Airbnb, which is what I'll mainly be talking about, and has come up in each of the talks now, but you could also think about Uber or the scores of other online marketplaces that pop up over time. And the thing that I've been thinking about and interested in this domain is the role of platforms as market designers, kind of the choices that the platform can make to affect an outcome. Now, the specific choice that I want to be thinking about today is a choice that has changed over time. So now I want to give a little bit of history on my marketplaces so we could think about some of the early platforms like eBay and Amazon. And actually, they got a lot of credit for not only making markets more efficient, but at the time, people thought that they were also going to make markets fairer or more inclusive. So what do I mean by that? There's been a lot of documentation of all sorts of racial discrimination, gender-based discrimination in offline markets. And there's been a lot of regulation in offline markets over time to try to reduce the amount of discrimination. And part of the early promise of online platforms was to get rid of some of the information that facilitates discrimination in offline markets. And essentially, if you think about buying something online, you could go on eBay, order a book. The book could come from another city. Oh, thank you. The book could come from another city, and you would never have to interact with the person that you transacted with. And this could happen for transactions of all scales. Now, the promise of that was that there's not going to be discrimination in markets that are facilitating these types of arm's length transactions. Just get to where we are. Show some. Okay. That there's going to be some promise of that. So basically here I was going to say is that there's a bunch of things that we know about designing online marketplaces, essentially the types of choices that platforms have. You choose a pricing system. One thing I'll just kind of mention, since it came up before, is that platforms actually also set all sorts of price floors and price ceilings. So it's something I think pretty deliberately about, even if it's kind of not at the level of kind of what a regulator would want. So my favorite example of this is Odesk, which is now called Upwork, is an online marketplace, and they actually voluntarily set a minimum wage for $3 per hour for all employees on there, which was above the market range for kind of whole countries worth of employees that were opting into the platform. But aside from price mechanisms, there's kind of reputation mechanisms. So when we think about building trust in online marketplaces, that's the type of stuff we're thinking about. You have a review system, you have kind of product information, and you have some seller and buyer information. And really kind of the one thing I want everybody to get out from today is that the rules that the market designers set are going to shape all the outcomes on the platform. And as I mentioned, there's been this transition in the level of anonymity. And the way to think about this is things were fairly anonymous. And actually, some of the early research show that this did get rid of discrimination in markets where it was well documented. So probably the most notable example of this is there's been a lot of work on bias in purchasing cars, where there's a negotiation process and kind of a lot of disparities across race and gender lines. But actually, this paper by Morton and Zettelmeyer showed that the amount of discrimination went down after people started making purchases online. In fact, they showed that there was no evidence of racial or gender discrimination for transactions that initiated online, kind of showing the promise of that. But thinking about the transition of the internet, there's actually this famous 1993 New Yorker cartoon that says, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Except now, as we all know now, that's no longer true. It, in fact, prompted the New Yorker to have another cartoon that says, remember when on the internet nobody knew who you were? And basically, I think that's a lot of what's going on here. So I won't give an overview of Airbnb. I think everybody in this room knows what it is. And basically, Airbnb works because they make a lot of choices to facilitate transactions. And we have a series of papers that demonstrate that these choices that build trust on Airbnb also facilitate discrimination. Just to give a concrete idea of the types of design choices Airbnb makes, here's a listing of places on Airbnb. It basically looks like listings on Priceline or anywhere else, except instead of just seeing the places, you're also seeing the people that are renting the place out. So now you're kind of reintroducing this personal information that had disappeared in early generations of online platforms. So to get at discrimination against guests on Airbnb, we ran a traditional audit study, the types of things that actually that a lot of governments do in offline rental markets. But we ran 6,400 person experiment where we sent out these applications and we only changed the profile of the person that was going. In fact, we kind of chose this one audit technique that's popular in the US, which is to choose names that kind of statistically identify your race as a guest. So we made our bookings for a weekend that was 2 months away, and we tracked what people said. And essentially, what we found is that there was an overall acceptance rate in our experiment of about 50%, which is ballpark in line of what Airbnb has. But actually, African-American guests were about 8 percentage points, which is about 16% less likely to be accepted for a place relative to white guests who had the same message and the same profile otherwise. Now, just to put this finding into context, suppose you were to run the same experiment on Priceline or Orbitz or any other online platform, you would basically see zero discrimination, because Priceline isn't really set up in a way to allow Marriott to easily discriminate when people are booking, whereas Airbnb is. Another kind of context is to think about offline rental markets. There's been 50 years of regulation in the US at least trying to get rid of discrimination, and audit studies have shown that the amount of discrimination in offline rental markets has gone down a lot over time. So this kind of raises the possibility of erasing some of the civil rights gains that we've seen in the offline world. But kind of as a market designer, Airbnb makes a bunch of choices. We have other findings in the paper that I'll basically skip over, but the punchline I would say that's relevant, that's most relevant, is that discrimination is fairly persistent. So it's not just the case that people who have like a single room in their place are the ones discriminating and nobody else is, but actually people with multiple listings who basically look like any bed and breakfast are also discriminating on Airbnb. People who are renting out their entire place versus just a room are also discriminating discriminating. So it's persistent discrimination. It happens regardless of the demographics of the neighborhood. It happens regardless of the quality of the listing. But kind of the one glimmer of hope we saw actually is that you could predict who's going to discriminate and who's not. In fact, all of the discrimination was occurring among people who had never had an African-American guest before. So this wasn't just a case of kind of people having a bad experience and taking it out on somebody else. This is a case of some set of hosts that are willing to discriminate relative to other hosts that are on Airbnb. In the time since this paper came out, I've been working on a series of solutions to help platforms reduce the amount of discrimination while not kind of limiting the bottom line. I have a chapter on this and an HBR article that are just reading that I'll gloss over for now for sake of time. But I've also been working with platforms on what might be done. The flavors of things platforms could do would be controlling the amount of information. You could imagine Airbnb delaying the point at which you see everybody's picture so that you could focus on the place first and focus on the person later. You could also imagine making their discrimination policy more salient. You could increase the number of people who opt into instant booking, which means that they're willing to basically act more like Priceline and allow somebody to take the place or to take their place without kind of having the right to screen them based on their looks first. You could have badges, and we created our own partial solution, which is a plugin it's a Chrome extension called Debias Yourself, which blinds transactions on both sides of it, which is basically for well-intentioned hosts and guests who don't want to discriminate but are afraid that unconscious bias may tick in. So we started presenting in my first call with Airbnb about the topic. So we had some calls with them in prior years, but after we did this most recent paper, we had a series of phone calls and made roughly this list of solutions. I'll let Patrick talk about what's been implemented, but to a first approximation, they're experimenting with the first one, and they're implementing pieces of the next two, and have a series of other things that they've been thinking about. There's a full 32-page report that you could have on their that you could read on their website that has some but not everything. But the one thing that I would say is I think the challenging thing is the following thought experiment. Suppose that we were to rerun this study in 6 months after Airbnb has kind of implemented all of their changes. What would be an acceptable rate of discrimination, especially kind of when you put this into like the context of offline marketplaces that have strong regulatory approaches to get rid of discrimination? What are we willing to live with in the collaborative economy that has gone away in other places? In terms of takeaways on market design, this question comes up about what value is created by online marketplaces. Online marketplaces really are changing the world. They enable a bunch of transactions that otherwise wouldn't happen, and according to most estimates, there's a lot of value actually being created by platforms in terms of efficiency gains. But there's market design challenges that abound, and they're well beyond the pricing types of issues that came up in the early days of eBay, who was deciding should we have an auction or should we have a price. And a bunch of seemingly innocuous design choices have a lot of unintended consequences. I can guarantee that nobody at Airbnb kind of set out to say, hey, you know what we should do in our product? We should facilitate discrimination that had gone away in offline markets. It's just that somebody said, let's get as much information out there as possible and try to focus entirely on growth without thinking about what some of the other consequences might be. So by thinking about this as a platform, I think about how can you maximize the value of your reputation system while minimizing unintended consequences. And for me, actually, I take a lot of inspiration from this Golden and Rouse paper that I had first read when I was a grad student. And essentially, they were doing this work on symphony orchestras. And it turns out that orchestras used to be very male-dominated, and over time, that's not the case anymore. Now there's a lot more equality. And it turns out that one small change had happened that had facilitated a lot of this, which is that instead of auditioning in front of the person that you were playing, that was evaluating you, there was a screen put between you and the evaluator. And essentially what this did, it allowed them to focus on the person who's playing rather than on the music being played rather than on the looks of the person. So thinking about this, I found this to be exciting that such a small change could have such a big impact. They said that this essentially accounted for 25% of the shift in the composition of orchestras. But I was also frustrated at the context specificness of the result when I first read it. I'll just stop here because where I want to leave this is that I think what the promise of the digital age is it allows us to rethink where we're going to put these types of screens. Essentially, every decision that any online platform makes is where do you want people to see information and where do you want to shroud things. Thank you.
That was brilliant, and I'm sure we will touch on some of that in our session. And if we think about the fact that the University of Hertfordshire, I think, did their research that showed that you could classify 5 million workers in the UK as being participating in the gig economy, if you think about some of the unintended discrimination and bias that might happen as a result at that kind of scale, people like Michael's work becomes really, really important. But we will return. Airbnb's been mentioned a few times. Patrick will be chomping at the bit to say things, I know. Those of you who don't know, Patrick Robinson is Director of Public Policy Airbnb. He leads a team of public affairs professionals across cities, across the world, to try and open the door for new forms of tourism and sustainable economic growth within cities. Welcome, Patrick Robinson.
God, where to start? There's a lot there. I think what Mike and others have pointed out here is that the superpower of the collaborative economy is also the kryptonite of the collaborative economy. And it's the fact that although these are technologically driven business models, and although there is a huge amount of design and management that goes into running these platforms, ultimately these are real people we're talking about. And people are unpredictable, and they behave in some very predictable ways, but also in ways that we can't necessarily anticipate, nor are we necessarily in a position to shape their behaviour. And frankly, nor are governments necessarily in a position to shape their behaviour. One of the regulatory challenges across the collaborative economy is that where governments have traditionally focused on regulating businesses and are, by and large, pretty good at that, regulating individual behaviour is a darn sight harder, and that requires a degree of collaboration and creativity between the platforms who are driving the commercial collaborative economy and those who are trying to deliver great social and societal outcomes. You all know what we would argue at Airbnb the kind of core social economic value of the collaborative economy is the spread of tourism into neighbourhoods that don't normally see it, the connection that you make as a human being when you travel this way versus a traditional form of tourism, the tax revenue that we generate in cities like Amsterdam and Paris and Lisbon that go directly to the cities concerned. And you only need to talk to Airbnb hosts across Europe and hear their stories and hear what being part of this economy means to them and to their families, not just economically, but socially. One of the most recent reports we put out focuses on the astonishing growth of senior citizen hosts on Airbnb. This notion of the hipster economy that we talked about earlier, actually, we're a long way past that now. The average age of an Airbnb user in the UK is pretty much above 40 now. So this is not just for the young and hip. This is for just about everybody. So there is a huge amount going on at grassroots level. What we can do as a platform is to help boost that value and direct it in ways that can deliver great results. So if you look at things like our disaster response program that allows hosts to open their homes for free to people in need of short-term accommodation. We've just activated the tool in Italy, for example, with the recent earthquake there. We are partnering with sharing cities like Milan and Amsterdam to look at issues that they care about and look at how we can drive our community and help connect our community to their outcomes. That could be digital inclusion, as we're talking about in Milan. It could also be about cultural tourism, as we're talking in London. That crowdfunding program that Finn talked about earlier in London, we're a key partner on one of the projects there that is going to rebuild a community centre in southeast London, and our host community is already getting involved in that. So there's a lot we can do to boost the intrinsic social value and economic value and cultural value of these platforms. As I said, though, this is about people, and people don't always behave in the way that you would like them to. Mike's talked very eloquently there about the discrimination issue, and that, I think, is a really, really important and has been a really important moment for us as a company. We were founded by 3 white middle-class dudes. They didn't think about unconscious bias when they built the platform. What we are doing now is taking the research that Mike has done, the feedback from the community, all of the pressure that we've been under politically in the States, and we've decided that we're going to try and do something to fix this. Now, offline racism, offline discrimination is obviously an issue way beyond any one collaborative economy platform, but we have decided and really taken some decisive action to try and see what works here, try and figure out how we can solve this issue, confront it, shape behaviour in a way that delivers on the promise of the collaborative economy for users. There is no doubt that we were slow to recognise the issue, no question about that. But we focused relentlessly on it since then. If you're an Airbnb user, you will have received an email from us just in the last couple of days asking that you commit to our new community commitment, which is a very, very explicit anti-discrimination policy that says that to be a member of this community, to be a member of our community, you must adhere and agree to non-discrimination. That has caused a degree of anxiety amongst some groups on our platform, some members of our community who like choosing who comes into their home and do so along their own cultural values and norms and not ours. That's a challenge we need to face down. If I think about the global impact of this too, there are countries in the world that actually mandate and require discrimination from hosts. If you think about being a gay traveller travelling in certain parts of Africa or the Middle East, hosts are in a difficult situation there where we could be putting them in a position where we're either asking them to violate our community commitment or we're asking them to violate the law, which we obviously wouldn't want them to do. So as we think about this approach globally, we need to try and confront some of those issues too. So what are we doing? As Mike says, I'm not going to repeat some of the things that we're doing, but those principles have come out, clear policy that every member of the community must agree to, and if you don't agree to it, you can no longer play a part in the Airbnb platform. We are looking at rebalancing where photos come in the flow. I think one of Mike's original recommendations a while back was to try and recreate the symphony example and actually remove photography completely from the transaction. And we've taken the view, and the experts that we brought in to advise us on this have agreed that we can find a middle way there. It's very important when you're inviting somebody to stay in your home that you feel comfortable, that you are making choices on that basis. But we are going to look at where we surface that in the flow of information. We are dramatically increasing the number of listings that you can book without having to exchange messages with a guest. Instant book, we have an ambition to have that for about 1 million of our 2.5 million listings by the beginning of next year. We are training our customer care staff in better ways of dealing with queries and concerns from guests that they've been discriminated against. We are implementing anti-bias training that's being delivered by some of Mike's colleagues at Harvard, where hosts can learn about how to counter some of their intrinsic biases. And we as employees are going through that too. And I think that's the other point. The 3 white dudes thing was a real problem. We are not as diverse internally as we should be. And that leads to us not necessarily seeing what our community sees through their eyes. So we are embarking on a very, very ambitious program, certainly in San Francisco, where diversity is a huge issue for us as a company, to try and rebalance that and to try and start reflecting the world and reflecting the community that uses us. So I think there is a huge amount of self-regulation that platforms can do. There is a huge amount that platforms can learn from, and lots of best practices that we can share, and lots of things that we can just try out. Equally, governments need to come along with us for the ride. I mean, we could talk about all kinds of other unintended consequences. We talked a little bit about neighbourhood nuisance. We've responded to that through a 24/7 helpline for people to report nuisance so that we can take action. We could talk about illegal listings, as Boyd was talking about earlier. We can find out ways to do that, but we need to dialogue with governments. We need to talk to governments. We need to talk to regulators to find creative solutions, and we need to figure out what works, because these are real people we're talking about, and they don't always respond to the same kind of regulatory levers that businesses do. So that's what I would say. I'm glad for us to start the conversation.
Brilliant. Okay. Okay, if you join us on stage here. That's right, in the order that you've been informed. A shameless plug for a joint venture between the Behavioural Insights team and Nesta would be our Be Applied platform, which is a recruitment platform that eliminates the bias in recruitment processes. So just if Airbnb would like to use that would be great. And indeed anybody else. So I know that there'll be lots of questions here, and I'm not going to hold us up too long before opening up on the floor. But I do have two questions that I'd like some quite swift responses to. And one is a little bit unfair for some of you maybe, but I want you to answer the Slido question too. On balance, do you think that the commercial collaborative economy mostly hinders or mostly encourages social value?
Well, okay, I'll go first. I think it mostly helps social value, but I don't come at that, and certainly we at Airbnb don't come at that with a kind of Pollyanna-ish view that it's just going to be okay. I think we've learned a lot over the last couple of years, and we've learned that there are downsides. There are sometimes winners and losers here, and it's incumbent on us to figure out how to minimise that impact and to help actually maximise the social value.
So that would be an encouraging, yep. Alex?
I would say, only 50% ducking the question, that the right verb is reshapes. So I think that what it does is it takes human interaction and it subtly changes it into something else, rendered through the guise of these sorts of transactions. The type of relationship I have with an Airbnb guest or host is different to that I would have with a friend, and it is different to that I would have with a hotel. It is a different thing entirely. So I think that is the question. I think for us to look in terms of sort of net reduction or increase is probably the wrong approach. We should look at how it's changing the nature of it.
Thank you.
So I'm going to give you a bit of a wishy-washy answer because I think it's complicated. I feel like a lot of these platforms have been changing over time, and we're seeing diversity within these sort of commercial platforms. So I feel like Airbnb has been trying to make strides in these sorts of areas that we've called them out on collectively. And similarly, I think that Uber has made some interesting partnerships that I spoke about in the US, and we have platforms like Juno, which are hybrids, and I feel like there's a lot more potential for these sorts of platforms to encourage social value.
So compared to a world without the platforms, I think they've clearly created value, social for users. But I think kind of compared to the world in which kind of they were held to the same standards as offline counterpart companies, there's kind of a reduction in value, and there are avoidable mistakes that I think could be fixed.
And a second question, which is, in the corporate world, the major global corporate world, we've seen an evolution from community engagement as a corporate right the way through to corporate social responsibility, through to this idea of shared value. So the question really is, notwithstanding whether they do have social value or not, do you think that these platforms have a responsibility to drive social value in the same way that corporates are adopting that agenda too? Maybe think about that one.
It's really hard to answer that in a way that doesn't sound like, I'm trying to lecture other companies on how to run their business. I think you just have to consider what you want to do as a company. I don't think there is anything. I don't think companies necessarily have a responsibility to drive social value. I think they can choose to do so, and I think there are some models that make it significantly easier to do so than not. But that's just a personal view. I mean, it's complicated.
Okay.
The sort of sticking point I had with one of Michael's points, and a point Patrick mentioned just briefly, was around the discretionary nature that the supply side often has in these transactions. So I don't think, for me, it doesn't work to say, well, if Airbnb behaved like Priceline, then there'll be no discrimination. Airbnb is not Priceline, okay? Now, when I'm hosting on Airbnb, I'm doing that with the expectation that there is something discretionary there. Now, I can give you some examples of this. Now, I, for example, like hosting people that work in tech. I like that because I get to talk to them, I get to network, it's interesting for me. Does that make me discriminatory against everyone else? I like hosting people who come from China in Southeast Asia because I've spent a lot of time there. Does that make me racist against everyone from any other different ethnic background? So for me, this is the kind of interesting area. Actually, like, what rules apply when there is a significant element of discretion? And I think that the platforms have to tread carefully because that is an important part of the contract they make with the individual, that they are not a business provider. They're an individual who can bring their own preferences to each transaction, each relationship that they build.
Okay. So I'm going to say that platforms in the sharing economy do have a responsibility in this area because it comes back to the business model, which is they are intermediaries. The value that's being created is actually from these platforms connecting users to one another, and it's the users sharing their things with one another that's creating value. It's the users themselves that are creating value. So without the users, these sorts of intermediaries, these platforms wouldn't have anything. And so I think that there is a responsibility to acknowledge that value in that relationship.
Michael, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. So I think that overall, it's clearly, I think, even in a lot of these companies' best interest to create social value. And kind of myopically, like in the heat of the moment of just trying to grow users at all expenses, I think it's tempting to kind of take shortcuts and avoid things that are going to leave all of your users better off in the long run. But I think kind of a forward-looking company that kind of projects what some of these issues are is better off and doesn't have to kind of deal with them after the fact as they get brought up by regulators and users and researchers who are kind of like turning over stones that they could have seen on their own.
I think the other dimension is how the platforms recognize what the users are doing and responds to it. So the disaster response program came from a grassroots demand in New York around Hurricane Sandy, where a user wanted to list her space at no dollars per night, and our system didn't permit it to be done. But rather than say, well, that's just dumb, like, actually we recognized that there were lots of people who wanted to do this, and actually we thought that was a good thing to do. And so actually having good feedback mechanisms that allow you to see what the community is doing, both positively and negatively, and course correct on that or innovate on what we can see going on is really, really important.
I think it's really interesting. Does Airbnb have a view on what constitutes a disaster? Because it could be, you're making a decision there, aren't you?
We had, in the early days, it was about teams on the ground just sort of flagging that something had happened and could we help? We didn't have much of a kind of an internal calibration on, well, this one's good enough, this one's bad. We've started employing people with deep expertise in disaster response who used to work for the Red Cross and used to work for whatever, who can help guide those decisions. But honestly, if on the ground we say, look, this is something that we want to do and our users are demanding it, like, we're not going to not do it exactly. Because, sorry, your disaster's not big enough. That's not,
I wasn't suggesting that you would. I wasn't suggesting, but disasters can be sometimes quite personal, right? So, anyway. So let's open it up to the floor, and we'll take 2 questions at a time. Please wait for the microphone to get to you. Keep your questions pithy. Look, 2 hands went directly up over there. The lady in blue in the end, and then the lady with the stripy top in front of her.
Hello.
Can we turn the microphone on? Do you want to shout?
Hi, okay. Thanks for your presentations. I think now it's working. So you talked a lot about the potential to generate lots of sustainable value. You mean like economic, social, environmental at the same time, and we talked about regulation. So I was wondering, you've mentioned regulation can be implemented by a platform, by the user, make them aware of their actions, and also by governments. And I mean, that's what we're talking about today. So there are different entities, and I'm just curious about your opinions. Whom do you think, which entity has the major responsibility? Or can you even say that? Or is it like equal responsibility? And yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so whose responsibility is the regulation? And then if we go to this lady here.
Hello, good afternoon. Marilee Carr from Under the Doormat. I think one of the challenges as an industry that we face is that you have trust is one of the core elements to make it all work. And in order to have trust, you need a lot of transparency. And whether that's photos of people or verifications or all different kinds of things. And the more transparent you are, the more you open yourself up for the potential for discrimination. So how do we get that balance right as an industry? Because we can go very far to preventing discrimination and actually undermine the element of trust. So just curious for thoughts on that.
Great. Well, let's take that first. Balancing transparency and discrimination. Who would like to take a punt at that? Michael?
I think in some situations that trade-off exists, but I would say, for example, on the Airbnb front, there are a lot of things, some of which they're doing, that seems like it neither reduces the ease of building trust, nor kind of, but could still have an effect at reducing discrimination. So like the simple example would be taking all the photos and moving them from page 1 of searches to after you click a little bit. So somebody who wants to see all of the picture and all the other things is able to see that information, but at the same time, you're not kind of telling them this is the first order thing that you should be thinking about when you're kind of evaluating a place to stay. I think there's other situations where, I guess the generalized version of that is to think about like what should a reputation system look like, and it could be, you can imagine decomposing what are the things that it takes to build trust and putting into point systems, like you can imagine ways to build a reputation system without pictures. I guess it depends on what you think people are getting from pictures. Is it just kind of reducing social distance, or is it some other information you want them to take action on? And in terms of the regulation question, I think in lots of situations, incentives are probably more aligned than people might initially think they are. But I think kind of then there are other situations where where regulation is necessary. And I think this is exactly the types of things that I think regulators are also trying to figure out, like kind of what's Airbnb going to do, how much of the problem is this going to solve, and is that enough for kind of whatever standard they want to hold for the industry.
Any other responses?
Let's see what works. I think there is a truism actually that has kind of taken hold, which is that radical transparency is kind of the driver of trust, and that the more transparent you are, the more trustworthy you are. And I think now's a good time for us just to step back and question whether that is actually the case, and whether some of the steps that we're going to take, actually drive trust upwards by pulling back on some of that, and just testing and seeing based on evidence what actually works and what doesn't. Because it may be that when it comes to trust, people are ultimately looking at other things rather than a photo of your smiley face. Because actually, when you look at some of the photos on our site, not all of them are actually clear, like who the hell it is. Sometimes people have got a photo of them and several other people. It's not always the best driver of people's of their reputation per se. So let's see. I mean, I think that's the great opportunity we have here. On the regulatory point, look, ultimately, governments are responsible for setting laws and for enforcing them. Platforms do play a role in helping to shape behavior in a way that aligns with those. As Michael says, those incentives are often aligned. None of us go out to run a business that is, causing people problems or driving rent costs up. There is lots of alignment there, and we will figure out what works. But I think there is also a vigorous debate, and it goes to the point that was being made earlier about data. There is a point at which we, again, as a society, need to decide whether we're happy having big American tech companies enforcing rules in a perhaps less than transparent way. We have this discussion when it comes to regulating speech online. We have it in relation to all kinds of things online, where there's been a vigorous debate about where we're prepared to draw the line. I think that line shifts about quite a lot, and again, we need to find out where that balance is in each individual case.
I think that's really interesting, and the sort of other sessions that have been running in different parts of this building on ShareLab today have been looking at collaborative models within things like the health and social care sector and within the education sector. And so all the things that are being learnt here are not just applicable to commercial platforms, but have some relevance or can inform in some ways the way we enter into much more high anxiety, crunchy public service delivery when it comes to negotiating trust, transparency and rules and regulation. My instinct is that governments, users, and the platforms themselves must do this in partnership in some way, mustn't there? Because for any one to be privileged over the other creates some kind of challenge, I would say. Let's have a couple more questions. Are there any? Two hands shot up there. The lady next to there, and then the gentleman here.
Hi there. I'm sorry it's not on. I'll just give a shout. Yes, no, I'm Elizabeth Douay. And,
if you hold it closer to you as well.
Up here, can you hear? Yes, yes. So Elizabeth Douay, and I'm working to set up Sharing Economy Ireland in Ireland. And I think it's interesting to talk about the regulatory aspect of it, and I think adding on to your comment that really everyone needs to work together. And I look at it as the way that collaborative platforms are allowing some social initiatives that wouldn't be imaginable, maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And if I look at one in Ireland where a lady's trying to use accommodation with senior citizens that have extra space in their house to lodge people that are homeless. And in reality, everyone say this is fantastic, but when she works with the government or looks for agencies that support homeless and then goes to work as well with agencies that are supporting senior citizens, the dialogue between the two of them is impossible. And I think that's where we can look at perhaps facilitating and adapting models that work to impact social. So I think regulation is there, but if we can look at adapting and coming together on it, I think we can have some interesting social initiatives that take place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this gentleman, is it Mark?
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Mark White from Kirklees Council.
Speak up and into the microphone a little
Mark
bit.
White from Kirklees Council in West Yorkshire. Thank you. Our council operates a resource sharing platform, Camoodle, whereby we lend council assets to community groups for their use, and we also facilitate the exchange and borrowing and lending of assets between groups to enhance their activities. And we get asked about it a lot, and we refer to it variously as a sharing economy platform or a collaborative economy platform, fairly interchangeably, probably fairly vaguely in our use, and I've heard it throughout the day, the two terms used interchangeably. As things progress, is it still appropriate or relatable to refer to arguably different business model platforms like Airbnb and Uber as collaborative economy, albeit commercial, collaborative or sharing economy, or is it time to come up with a new definition to disaggregate those two types of platform?
So, shall we create a new word today?
I'll
Definitions, Alex.
I'll have a crack at this. So, I was asked to write a book about the sharing economy, and the first thought that went through my head is, this is an incredibly interesting phenomenon, but I really don't like this term sharing economy. Of course, I need to release a book about the sharing economy because that's where the search volume is, that's where the SEO is, that's what it's called. Now, in the fullness of time, that term will probably be eroded. Think about how a while ago we thought about internet on our phones, or before that, like WAP, mobile. Yeah, and now it's just going online, and you don't think about it as a subconscious sort of category, and I think the same thing will happen here. It won't be a very conscious category of the wider economy. I think that the sharing economy as a term has got itself into trouble by appearing sort of whiter than white. We've talked a little bit today about how there are winners, but also there are losers, and I'm sure many of your other panels earlier today have sort of addressed that too. For me, in terms of your specific question, the sharing economy works as a definition when you're talking about assets, fundamentally. Physical assets. Now you can stretch it a bit and say, oh, we're talking about intangible assets of skills and time. But like really, this is fundamentally a physical asset, idling capacity, let's sweat these assets type play. Whereas the collaborative economy I see as a broader phenomenon, which would encompass things like crowdfunding or models where there are people coming together to transact, to disintermediate incumbent businesses on the basis of new efficiencies.
Great. Brhmie, did you
I
want to
actually just do want to add to that. I quite like the fact that it's called the sharing economy, and I think that's because I feel like it forces these platforms to live the values of what it would mean to be a sharing economy. I feel like there's been so many articles that have been written about, the debate over whether or not we should call it the gig economy or the sharing economy, et cetera. But I feel like the fact that people are questioning that has to do with the fact that they think that the sharing economy should really embody something else. And these platforms are being held to account for the fact that they don't necessarily embody those ideals. And so I feel like it makes us think about what we actually want the sharing economy to look like and what we want and expect from these businesses.
And there's something about the public consciousness, isn't there? So most of the people that I know have an understanding of what Airbnb and Uber. They don't, when I say the sharing economy, they look at me slightly blankly. You know, this isn't something that exists so widely in the world, and therefore one has to question how important definitions are in some ways, possibly.
Well, Uber also actively rejects
they
being
do,
called
yeah.
a sharing economy platform when it suits them, actually, and in some markets. So they explicitly and actively decided not to participate in Sharing Economy UK because, for whatever reason, or sensibly, non-sensibly, whatever you want to call it, they just said, well, our business model in the UK is licensed minicabs. It's not like ride sharing.
That's true, but...
So they decided not to get involved in that organisation. They have chosen a different route in some of their other European markets where they do operate or have previously operated those things.
Okay. I was just going to say that Uber Eats is very similar to Deliveroo, and Deliveroo is now joining the Sharing Economy UK.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's difficult.
But again, when we formed Sharing Economy UK, we had the same conversation that sort of Alex has just had, which is fish where the fish are. You know, if the review that sparked the growth of sharing, or the establishment of Sharing Economy Sharing Economy UK was called the Sharing Economy Review. Now, at Brussels level, Commissioner Biankowska and others have chosen very explicitly to talk about the collaborative economy because they see that as a more inclusive term that encompasses many more variants of these kind of on-demand, gig, sharing, collaborative, peer-to-peer marketplaces. I guess that PhDs will be written from now until, the 22nd century on, what to define it as, what to call it as.
I'm sure all of us on this stage, and even probably, I'm sure some of you have been involved in quite endless and circular conversations about what we should call the sharing economy.
So just to pick up Brhmie's point, because it's always nice to have
because
a
it's
little
obviously an endless debate.
on stage, back and forth. I remember interviewing a CEO when I was writing The Business of Sharing. It's a fairly big business, valued at a couple of $100 million. And he looked me in the eye when I was interviewing him, and he said, you and me, people like us building real businesses, we know this whole sharing economy thing is a load of bullshit. And I won't disclose who that is. But I'm not sure that actually the sharing economy term per se does encourage businesses to sort of raise their game. I think there's an equally strong argument that actually it's used as a kind of moral armor, and it allows them to actually lower their game in many respects.
Interesting. A debate that could go on.
I think,
Let's not do that.
With things like racism, those are the values of those founders. I don't think it's anything to do with the sharing economy. It's their own ethos behind the business that makes them want to make changes.
Yeah. I just returned to your first point, Alex, which was that in a couple of years' time, maybe there won't even be this term anymore. So highly likely, in my view. So let's have a couple more questions. Valerie, you wanted to ask a question, and then this gentleman here.
My name is Valerie Mocker from Nesta. So we talked about bias and trust and social value, and all of these things are quite culturally dependent, and also they differ according to culture and social group. So what I wanted, and maybe this is particularly a question for Patrick and Alex, when you as businesses think about how you can kind of implement certain policies, which kind of level do you think on? Is it the kind of city level, or the national level, or the EU level, or the global level? And probably, we need to think about all of these levels, but if you had to pick one, level and go out to a policymaker tomorrow and talk to them about certain things, or think about your own policies, what level would you start with?
Okay, brilliant. And then if we could pass.
Hi, my name's Ed. So kind of a lot of you have touched on this idea of the success of these platforms being about making it more efficient to connect people, but then also quite a lot of the issues you've talked about. So Michael with the discrimination, and Alex's example of the tension of the woman going to pick up the car have actually been that when people connect, it's that kind of messy social aspect that is inefficient, and as the platforms start to scale, they're kind of removing that social aspect in a sort of drive for growth and efficiency. And I guess it'd be interesting if you talk about that tension between the kind of economic efficiency and the removing the social value to make the platform more successful.
Okay. So does if I interpret that correctly, so perhaps in the growth of a particular platform, does social capital, that social cohesion, erode over time relative to a platform scaling?
If I'm staying somewhere on business and I'm staying in a spare bedroom, the likelihood is I'm tired, I'm not going to want to be that sociable, so I'd much rather stay with a host who also declares that they're not necessarily keen on being that sociable too. It's a bit like the blah blah car model. So there are efficiencies that actually allow you to deliver better outcomes that more accurately reflect what all of the participants in the exchange actually want.
Can I prod you just slightly on that and say, have you noticed as the platform has scaled, people being more keen to occupy a place where the host is not there at all over the host being there? Because that's a rather more fundamental kind of choice that someone's making about on the level of kind of social interaction they want to have and how they perceive Airbnb as being either a place to make friends and community or a place to lay their head.
It's difficult to isolate that trend versus the other trends that you would see. So as we become bigger in some of the more kind of traditional holiday markets, vacation rental markets, coasts, mountains, the platform skews much more towards entire spaces and often professional holiday lets anyway. And of course, in those areas, that's what people are looking for. Mm-hmm. In the cities, I'm not sure that we've necessarily seen that trend, but still in the UK today, I mean, London is pretty much 50-50, entire homes, entire apartments.
Okay. Great. Another question of where should you should intervene, either city, national, wherever. What other comments might you have? Alex, did you want to say something?
Sure. So, my response to that would be it's sort of wherever the fight is. There have been times we've been in touch with individual councils, there have been times we've been in touch with city authorities, there have been times we've been speaking to Number 10. I mean, it would very much depend on what the law or regulation is that is being discussed. I think that's very much a sort of case-by-case basis. It's slightly different with a much larger business like Airbnb because Patrick and his team probably have more capacity to be proactive. In any sort of small company, sub a few hundred people, really you just don't have bandwidth. You're much more reactive. With relation to the gentleman's question, which I think is a very interesting one, about sort of people actually wanting more streamlined non-social interactions. I mean, I think there's a lot of truth in that. If you look at the really huge businesses, an Apple or a Coca-Cola, I think one reason why those businesses are big is quality control, is consistent consumer experience. I can get a can of Coke in Melbourne or Mumbai or Manchester and it's going to taste the same. And that creates a lot of value for that brand. So the question is, where does the sharing economy sort of sit, in relation to that? And I would say that there is a need to standardize, to professionalize to some extent, because while the early adopters might want quirkiness, might want individuality, the majority of people, the mass majority, are more risk averse. They want to know what they're going to get. They're less experimental, less adventurous, all these types of things. So I think the interesting challenge for a platform like Airbnb is fundamentally how does it borrow some of the right tricks from the hotel industry to make a room, to make a hospitality experience feel comfortable for the significant majority of the population. That might be installing smoke detectors and, I don't know, hotel-like comforts or whatever they are, but at the same time, not completely erase the humanness of the platform, which is key to its attractiveness, and also key to the value of the company, because some of you may have noticed who are regular users that Airbnb gets more expensive. There was a time probably when it was significantly disruptive on price, but that is actually changing. And if it's going to be a hugely valuable public company, it actually needs to offer value above and beyond just a room that is cheaper. There needs to be significant value in that social interaction, which is why I think the company is very prudent to make such significant investments in values and community and all these kinds of things that they talk a lot about.
Great. Now, in a moment or two, I'm going to ask you a final question, which you can think about while we ask the final questions of the audience, which is the ShareLab Fund, open today. It's been cast very broad. We're interested in a whole range of different ideas, whether they come from entrepreneurs or businesses or regulators or whoever. If you wanted to task ShareLab Fund with doing anything, what would it be? That's leave you pondering for a second. And we've probably got time for maybe one, maybe two questions from the floor. So your hand went up. Let yours be the last question. Wait for the microphone and then speak quite loudly into it.
We mentioned like whose job is it really to kind of regulate the sharing economy, whether that's government or whether that's the companies themselves. So in 2018, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, will come into effect, probably in England as well, more than likely. Kind of focusing mostly on Airbnb, with the right to kind of transfer your data, what work have you been thinking about with that, or do you have any comments about that specific part of that regulation?
And while we're asking, does anyone else have any comment on that apart from Airbnb? So we're aware that's a... No? Are you happy to answer that?
We're getting very niche here, aren't we?
A little bit niche.
The data portability requirement. Yeah, I mean, we will come into compliance with whatever the GDPR says. The question is, so General Data Protection Regulation contains a clause that requires online platforms, or in fact anybody processing data, I'm not exactly sure what the detailed wording is, to make that data portable and perhaps maneuverable to somewhere else. So in theory, you could take your Airbnb rating and upload it to Uber or whatever. It's really unclear how this is going to work in practice. But look, we'll look at it. We've got some time to come into compliance. We'll figure out what it is. I mean, there has been quite a lot of debate about actually transferring things like ratings and your reputation and how you can aggregate it so that you can take your Airbnb rating and use it on TaskRabbit or on something else. My general view on this is you might be an absolutely fantastic host, but you're a rubbish painter. So your reputation is quite context specific. So I think the demand for data portability on Airbnb is much more likely to be somebody who wants to leave the platform and go and list their place on HomeAway instead. Well, I don't know to what extent we're going to re-engineer the platform just to permit that, but we will make sure that we're in compliance with whatever comes through.
Be interesting to see how that develops. So my final question then, Michael, what should we be doing in ShareLab?
So I guess investing, I guess I'm not fully sure I follow the question.
Well, what research questions remain unanswered, or what practical things could we do? What experiments could we run?
So I think finding organizations to create a more inclusive society in a way where kind of incentives are aligned, but also where it's kind of a practical thing to do. I think there are lots of ideas out there that are kind of socially valuable, but may not actually be that implementable, or kind of there may not be kind of like more careful market analyses of like kind of can you design something that's actually going to be transformative. I think another underserved niche is kind of making policy better. So we actually have talked a lot about like kind of how regulators should think about Airbnb or like think about Uber, but actually there's lots of online platforms that could help governments be better at the things that they're doing. Yeah. So we did this project at Yelp, for example, where we took hygiene disclosure, which traditionally kind of, I mean, you can see it in London, like restaurants put their hygiene scores up on the door, but instead of putting them on the door, we ingest the data, put it into a standardized format, put it onto Yelp, and then you have kind of a collaboration between a series of governments and Yelp now that tells you where it could be disclosed, and then on the back end, we run these tests to see how should you design this disclosure to make it more effective. We also take Yelp data to kind of allocate health inspectors. So you can imagine finding lots of applications that are using kind of data that's coming from platforms to think about like how can you make your local government more efficient.
Interesting. Thank you. Brhmie.
So I don't actually know of a single platform co-op in the UK, and I feel like that's something that you might want to invest in or support.
There's a very, very active Facebook Rise of the Digital Cooperative group, actually, but I haven't found them. Yeah, I agree. We don't have many examples of it existing in practice yet.
I would like you to do some research on what tools and tactics help drive personal understanding and compliance with regulations.
Right.
So I think we're doing a lot. Others
Maybe
are doing
you
a
could
lot.
support us and do it.
I think we still have we still have a situation where, you know, I go to host meetups, and hosts in London, you know, even great hosts in London, it just hasn't occurred to them that there might be some planning rules that apply to their activity. They get that they probably have to pay tax on it, and they understand that bit of it, but there's just a ton of stuff that as an individual you can't possibly know unless you know that you're looking for it. So what are the ways that we can get people to behave effectively or behave in a way that everybody wants them to, that doesn't necessarily rely on the dead hand of government or the invisible hand of algorithms?
A good challenge, thank you. Alex?
So one of the areas that I'm currently working on is homelessness. And you know, a question that I asked myself earlier this year is, imagine you are getting off the tube, walking home, you see the same person that you've walked past lots of times there on the streets asking for money or busking or in a terrible way. What happens if you know their name? How does that change things? What happens if you know a little bit about them? How does that change things? What happens if there's a platform that allows you to contribute towards skills or training, provide funds that are administered by a responsible third party? What happens when you have a lot more transparency, in a word? And right now the barrier to actually helping someone who is homeless is incredibly high. That's crazy because there's lots of people that want to help. There's 100,000 homeless households in the UK. Right now also very, very little has been built in this area, which is kind of disgraceful actually, because you think about the homelessness situation in San Francisco and the huge amount of resources and talent that's been applied in every other imaginable area. So I would like to see ShareLab contribute in some way, shape or form to solving that problem in a collaborative way.
Sounds very worthwhile. Well, before we say thank you to our guests, I want to re-ask you that question that I asked you at the beginning, just to, you know, a whimsical way of testing whether anybody has changed their mind about whether they think, on balance, the commercial collaborative economy. I think you should be restricted from voting, actually, to be honest. You specifically, maybe. Does it mostly hinder or mostly encourage positive social impact? Now, look at the change. Or will it be changed? So where were we before? We were hindering as a majority last time, weren't we? Then
Get through Chica. There we go.
I can't see the number behind that. What does it say? So that doesn't look very different.
Get voting, people get
That doesn't
voting.
look very different at all. Actually, in fact, yes. Okay. Well, we haven't changed our minds today, but maybe that just tells us that the debate is complex and incomplete.
No, it's encouraging. It's encouraging.
It's encouraging. Well, that's a bit heartening, isn't it? The only thing that stands between you and a drink next door is to thank our brilliant guests. So please join me in thanking Alex, Patrick, Brhmie, and Michael. Thank you very much.